Well, hey Redemption, this week we are continuing looking at our core convictions, what we're calling the 6 C's here at Redemption Church. Now today we're looking at connection for the lonely. And as we've been doing, we're going to be looking at it through the lens of how does Christ connect the lonely? And then how does Christ use his people to bring connection for the lonely? So let's start off with that first part. How does Christ connect the lonely? Well, to answer that question, we need to first ask, why are we lonely? Why are our relationships not what they should be? And the answer comes when we look back to the fall and the entrance of sin into our world. When our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned in the fall, they brought in not just guilt before God, but also a fracturing of man's relationships, both to God and to each other. You see this immediately after the fall, when Adam and Eve are asked by God to give an answer for what is going on, what has happened. Adam turns on Eve and he tries to blame her for his sin. Eve then turns to the serpent, tries to shove off blame onto someone else as well. There is a hostility that is now set between man and fellow man. You see this intensify in Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel. Many of you know the story. Abel is seen to be righteous before God, and Cain, getting jealous, goes and slays his brother. He murders him. This hostility that is bred between man because of sin continues on and intensifies to the point where in Genesis chapter 6, God, making an assessment of the hearts of men, says that every intention of the thoughts of their heart is only evil continually in Genesis 6:5. Hostility, brokenness in relationship comes through sin. But not just between man and man, also between man and God. The Bible teaches us that sin has warped our desires for God. Sin has warped our ability to perceive his will as good and glorious like it is. The Bible tells us that we don't want God as we should. In Romans chapter 8, Paul is describing the sinful mind, the mind that is set on the flesh. And he says this, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And he goes on and he says, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. There is a brokenness of our relationship between God and man. What should have been loving care by God and loving service and worship by human beings now becomes anger, hostility, and on God's side, a judgment of our sin. So how does Christ repair this? What is the work of Christ on our behalf that does this? Well, we know that Christ saves us. We know that Christ removes our guilt before God. But Christ also heals not just our relationship with God, but our relationship to each other. He does this because we are united to him in salvation. We are brought together with God through our union with Christ. God gives us new desires, new relationship, new life because we are united to his Son. In the rest of Romans chapter 8, Paul goes on to say in verse 9, you, however, are not in the flesh but in the Spirit, if in fact the Spirit of God dwells in you. Anyone who does not have the Spirit of Christ does not belong to him, but if Christ is in you, although the body is dead because of sin, the Spirit is life because of righteousness. So if Christ is in us, we have new life through him and a new relationship to God. More than that, because we're united to his Son, God adopts us into his family. He views us as his children along with Jesus. Now, because God has adopted us into his family, that means that all of us who are united to Christ are now siblings. We have a new relationship to one another. And it's that new relationship through union with Christ that helps us to restore the relationship that was broken by sin between man and fellow man. Whereas we had hostility, now we care for one another. Whereas we had anger towards one another, or a desire to see us succeed and others not. We bear one another's burdens. We weep with those who weep. We rejoice with those who rejoice. We enjoy new relationship through Christ Jesus.
So with that being said, because now we who are far off, aliens and strangers, as Paul says in Ephesians 2, we now go and pursue those who are lonely or isolated or disconnected, and we want to extend relational love to them. Like, we want to, in love, go after them. A number of things Sean was talking about, just real briefly, serving people in love. Galatians 6, 1 through 10 talks about a number of ways to serve one another, whether it's bearing a spiritual burden or helping to care for something physically. Also, worshiping together. I know that in our crazy COVID times, worshiping together takes a bit of a different nuance. I mean, we can still be together worshiping as families, even if we're not in a particular location worshiping as one faith family. But worshiping together, coming and singing and praying and learning together the great truth of the gospel. One of the things we get to enjoy with one another now. Also, forgiving one another, forgiving each other. Ephesians chapter 4, 32. Forgiving one another just as God in Jesus Christ has forgiven you. When people look at the church from the outside, they should be, how do these people do what they do? Like, they actually forgive each other? That's crazy. That's not what's happening in our world, because we're a countercultural representation. And because Jesus has forgiven me, who am I to withhold forgiveness from you? They're looking at this living, breathing picture of the gospel as they're watching how we interact with each other. And then lastly, we talk about forgiving, we talk about serving, we talk about worshiping, but then also just honoring one another. Romans chapter 12 talks about, like, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor, in this way of just making sure that no one ever has to guess where we stand with them, because we're just going to show honor and love to them. And so we get to not just connect lonely people to other people, but we also get to build on these relationships that Christ has restored. Because he's restored us to himself, now we go about that work in the world and alongside one another. So next week, we have 3 more C's. We looked this week at the restoring wonders. Next week is the revealing wonders. We can't wait to dive into that with you.